So, yes, so I'm very pleased to be here. When I was invited, in my mind, I thought there would be 6 people present or 10 people present at my talk. I never expected so many people. So this is a good thing because, as you know, people have this image of Sweden as completely brainwashed Marxist society. Let me say this, that I have been, in my intellectual career, through the entire political intellectual spectrum. I started as a Soviet Marxist. I would even read Brezhnev's speeches to the communist gatherings they had every 5 years or so, the big ones. I then became a sort of third world Marxist, revolutions in Latin America, then move on into Western or New Left Marxist thinking. I stayed there for a while, went through many currents, analytical Marxism, Althusserian, Hegelian, then into existentialism, a bit mixing it all up, then middle stream liberalism, then neoconservatism, I supported the war in Iraq, then paleoconservatism, and then a few years ago I began to move into what you might call is the new right. And I did so through this entire movement. I mean, I was really in an old-fashioned way pursuing the truth. Obviously, the truth is not something we can get a handle of and grab it with certainty, but I do believe in that ideal. And as I am in this position now, which is the new right position, I feel that I am in a position that it is ethically valid, that it is one that in many ways, I cannot anticipate what will happen in the next years, but for a few years now that I feel quite comfortable, both in purely intellectual terms and in ethical terms. So it is the right position. It did not come to me simply by instinct, although that always plays a role, but it came to me in a very old-fashioned intellectual way. So the paper that I'm going to give today is kind of a bit academic. The title is Charles Taylor and the Politics of Recognizing the Collective Rights of Minorities While Suppressing European Majorities. Charles Taylor, viewed by some as the greatest Canadian thinker of the post-World War II era, is best known for developing a liberal theory of multiculturalism which recognizes the collective cultural rights of minorities within the Canadian Federation. His theory of deep diversity calls for a liberalism that is committed to the collectivist survival and enhancement of Aboriginals, Quebecois, as well as visible minorities within Canada. This is a theory that academics and media elites have employed effectively in the transformation of Canada into a diverse nation and in the selling of Canadian multiculturalism as a successful model to the world in justification of mass immigration. Critics of Taylor have said that his notion of deep diversity entails cultural demands by minorities inconsistent with the liberal principle that all citizens should enjoy the same rights as individuals. But I agree with Taylor's argument that the theory of individual rights contains within it the idea that humans should have a right to have their ethno-cultural identities recognized because such recognition is essential to the self-fulfillment of the individual. Taylor's communitarian argument that individuals can develop only as members of a community is sound. He correctly criticizes mainstream liberalism for advocating an incoherent conception of the individual existing outside and apart from a particular society rather than embedded within it. There is, however, a fundamental inconsistency in Taylor's argument. He applies the theory of cultural rights only to Aboriginals, Quebecois, and visible minorities or immigrants, in complete disregard for the cultural rights of the majority European Canadians. He never addresses the way in which the Canadian identity was constructed primarily within an Anglo community. Instead, he views this community as a place in need of alteration to accommodate the cultural expectations of minorities. Taylor's communitarianism is not rooted on the longings and historical identities of Europeans, but is an abstract theory dedicated to the elimination of any sense of racial identity among Europeans. It is an academic communitarianism, preoccupied with the protection of the cultural identity of non-Europeans in a world perceived to be dominated unfairly by Europeans. His communitarianism recognizes only the group rights of minorities, but not the group rights of European Canadians, in relation to which he emphasizes only the principle of individual rights combined with multicultural communitarianism. Taylor views any communitarian politics associated with European minorities as illiberal and discriminatory in nature. But it can be argued to the contrary that his communitarianism is plainly inconsistent with the very principle of communal liberalism he is advocating, in that it ignores the self-development of European individuals as members of a historic community within which they find meaning as individuals. But why should European nationalists be interested in Taylor's communitarianism if it is so inconsistently against the collective rights of Europeans? Because Taylor is the only communitarian among other highly influential philosophers such as Michael Walzer, Michael Sander, and Alistair MacIntyre, who emphasizes the central importance of deep recognition for the cultural rights of individuals. His concept of deep diversity goes beyond the standard communitarian preoccupation with socialistic policies, local communities, family life, and collective economic goods. At a time when European nationalists are in need of developing multiple strategies to counter the dominant discourse of cultural Marxism, it might be worthwhile to bring out the ways in which Taylor's justification and worldwide promotion of Canadian multiculturalism contains within itself the seeds for a strong political argument in favor of European identity. The critical assessment I'm proposing here against Taylor may be defined as an immanent critique, in which the objective is to detect contradictions in his thinkings which point to determinate possibilities for European nationalism within the current establishment. We can accept the substantive premises and truth claims of Taylor's communitarianism, enter his theory, register key contradictions, develop these contradictions according to their own logic, and in this way bring out support for European ethnic nationalism. We can show, in fact, that ethnic European nationalism is already implied in the theory of liberalism if we agree that liberalism presupposes a notion of ethnic community and recognition. According to Taylor, the principle that humans should have equal rights as citizens to express themselves without coercion is intimately connected to the human need for recognition. The need for recognition has been the driving motivation, he argues, behind current movements for gender parity, national self-determination, subaltern identities, Black civil rights, and Aboriginal rights. The need to be respected and acknowledged by others is a defining trait of our human nature. Taylor writes, quote, "Non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm, can be a form of oppression, imprisoning someone in a false, distorted, and reduced mode of being," end of quote. It was only in the modern era in Europe, he adds, that humans came to develop a liberal way of thinking that eventually and inevitably led to our current preoccupation with struggles for recognition. The liberal concern with the dignity of the individual, the right of every individual to be recognized as a citizen with equal rights, was itself a form of thinking calling for the equal recognition of humans as public citizens regardless of station, which was the basis for the rise of democratic culture in the West. According to Taylor, another intellectual current was added at the end of the 18th century to this concern with individual rights and recognition, a current best articulated by Rousseau, which had to do with recovering one's inner voice in the face of social conformity. Each human had a unique inner nature, insisted Rousseau, to which they should be true if they are to develop as original personalities. Then Herder came along, expressing this ideal at two levels, not only in terms of individual fulfillment, but also in terms of the fulfillment of national peoples to their own sense of identity. According to Herder, writes Taylor, quote, just like individuals, a vogue should be true to itself, that is, its own culture, end of quote. This concern with individual and national cultural authenticity was behind the romantic concern for the inner depths of individuals and the nationalist movements for self-determination in the 19th century. Taylor then writes about how Europeans later came to realize that the ideal of authenticity cannot be developed and fulfilled monologically, but presupposes, quote, a crucial feature of the human condition, end of quote, which is that we can only develop as human beings through interactions with others, dialogically. Discovering our personal and our national cultural identities doesn't mean separating ourselves from others and finding out who we are in isolation. Only by interacting with others do we form our identities, and we get to be recognized in varying degrees and ways. Taylor refers to the writings of George Herbert Mead and Bakhtin for this argument. It is now widely accepted in the Western world, he says, that our identities and sense of self-worth are formed in open dialogue. Quote, not only contemporary feminism, but also race relations and discussions of multiculturalism are undergirded by the premise that the withholding of recognition can be a form of oppression. Taylor tries to make a contribution to this accepted idea by working out a new theory of liberalism based on the principle of cultural recognition. He says that the principle of recognition is already implied by the standard theory of liberalism, since this theory proclaims that all humans want to be recognized as equal beings with the same public dignity rather than divided into first and second-class citizens. However, while this liberalism of individual rights speaks about the equal dignity of all and promotes rights meant to be universally the same, the cultural liberalism Taylor writes about recognizes the rights of all humans to have their own cultural identities. It emphasizes the right of cultural collective difference and authenticity. This liberalism is about the politics of difference. It is not about Aboriginals enjoying the same civic rights as whites, but about Aboriginals having the right to their own cultural identity, about living in a society in which they are not seen as an inferior cultural group expected to assimilate to a superior majority modern culture based on individual rights. While Taylor is clearly aware of the tensions that exist between a liberalism based on individual rights and a liberalism that grants minorities certain cultural rights and powers not enjoyed by other Canadians, he insists, quote, that the politics of difference grows organically out of the politics of universal dignity, end of quote. That is, the politics of cultural rights grows organically out of the politics of individual rights. If the politics of individual rights says that all human beings by birth are worthy of equal respect, the politics of cultural differences says that the identities of all humans as members of different cultural groups should be accorded equal respect. Taylor distances himself from the notion that all products of all cultures should be accorded equal respect, adding that the recognition that is expected here is that we grant members of all cultures, quote, the presumption, end of quote, that their culture has worth or value. He criticizes postmodernists who argue that there are no universal standards by which to judge different cultures, and that standards of worth are based on power structures. but also criticizes multiculturalists who believe that all cultures are of equal worth in their unique ways and that it is Eurocentric to judge them, arguing that it is patronizing for Westerners to voice equal love for all cultures. Yet in the end, Taylor insists that we should recognize the equal potential worth of different cultures. He finds limiting the liberalism of individual rights endorsed by John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, and Jürgen Habermas, and its claim that a liberal government should not endorse any culture but should remain neutral and simply afford all citizens the right to choose their own cultural ends. He defends the cultural right of the Quebec government to take a stand on the importance of preserving the culture of Quebec's ancestors. The Quebecois nationalists are correct to endorse a view of the good life rather than remaining neutral. It is good for the well-being of the Quebecois to feel that their cultural traditions are respected by the Canadian federal government. Quebec can be, quote, a society with strong collective goals and still be liberal, provided it is also capable of respecting diversity, especially when dealing with those who do not share its common goals. End of quote. Quebec can guarantee the survival of its ancestors while endorsing the rights to life, liberty, due process, and separation of church and state, including immigrants who wish to maintain their own cultural identity. Taylor thus endorses the collective rights of Quebecers and Aboriginal peoples to a distinct society status within the Canadian Federation, a form of self-government with a constitutional, quote, ability to adopt certain kinds of legislation deemed necessary for their survival, end of quote. Quebecois and Aboriginals should have their own communal culture, with their own territories, with their own institutional arrangements, holidays, and languages. This diversity is said to be deep because it grants extensive powers for territorial self-determination to Quebecois and Aboriginals, and because it goes beyond a merely legalistic understanding, beyond affirmative action and anti-discrimination laws, but calls also for a new concept of selfhood and identity among Canadians generally, in which diversity becomes intrinsic to their sense of well-being, something they practice, feel, and internalize within as part of their psychological makeup and everyday life experiences within their families, schools, churches, and careers. Taylor conceptualizes the cultural rights of Quebecois and Aboriginals as national peoples that may wish to remain distinctive, quote, through indefinite future generations, end of quote. The mainstream liberal theory of minority rights for immigrants does not adequately address the need of immigrants to preserve their own cultural traditions, but it's only about ensuring their success as individuals within Canada. Taylor pushes for a new liberalism that is committed to the collectivist survival and enhancement of non-European Quebecois and Quebecois within Canada, even if this entails collectivist demands by minorities that are inconsistent or in tension with the principle of individual rights for Canadians. While he does not think immigrants should be creating semi-autonomous territories and provinces in Canada, such as Nunavut and Quebec, he thinks that immigrants need more than external protections against majority decisions and affirmative action programs that provide them with opportunities for individual success. Taylor wants a Canada in which immigrant minorities are recognized as members of different cultures and are able to achieve success as members of collective cultural groups. The endorsement of a politics of cultural differences should be balanced with the principle of individual rights. And he goes on to talk about how there are limits to how much you can recognize the collective rights of cultural groups, and says that there are some problems with Islamic people assimilating, but I'm going to leave that out. I agree with Taylor that Quebecois and Aboriginals have a right to their own forms of national self-determination. Humans have a deep need to have their culture and ethnic identity recognized. I also agree that cultural identities are not easily reconcilable reconcilable with the mainstream principle of individual rights, and that the demand for cultural recognition may entail a demand for cultural survival, requiring individuals to exercise their choices and autonomy as members of a community in need of recognition. Taylor is realistic in understanding that millions of immigrants arriving from cultures lacking a liberal tradition may not want to relinquish their cultural and ethnic identities and dissolve themselves within an Anglo-communal culture. My disagreement with Taylor is that he never allows for the possibility that European Canadians also have their own collective customs, religious ways, and historical memories, including a strong belief in individual rights, which they may want to protect in the face of immigrants from illiberal cultures. Taylor takes it as given that the collective European heritage of Canada consists of no more than a set of procedural laws, equality under the law, institutional democratic templates, and a market economy deemed to be culturally neutral, and therefore equally available to members of other cultural traditions. He says that the Canadian federal government cannot be neutral on cultural matters only in regards to Quebecois, Aboriginals, and immigrant groups. All these groups, except European Canadians, stand for authentic traditions, particular customs, and historical experiences. The cultural role Taylor assigns to Europeans is that of affording everyone a liberal multicultural framework within which minorities are granted cultural recognition by the majority, with the majority required to engage in a cultural dialogue with the minorities, giving them the opportunity to preserve and enhance themselves as distinctive cultures, even if this distinction involves diluting and marginalizing the cultural heritage of the majority European founders of Canada. He thinks it is not fair to expect immigrants to give up their cultural ancestries and assimilate to a majority culture, but it would be racist and illiberal for European Canadians to insist on preserving their heritage in Canada. Anglos are perennially portrayed by Taylor as the dominant group in need of recognizing others, the same way a master needs to recognize the equal worth of a slave. So he writes, since 1492, Anglos, Europeans generally, have projected an image of minorities as somehow inferior, uncivilized, and through the force of conquest have been able to impose their image on the conquered, end of quote. There is no word about affording European Canadians some respect for having built the nation of Canada and having deeply felt attachments to their ancestral land and historical accomplishments. Taylor prefers to talk about how Europeans were colonial masters of many peoples around the world and how it would be, quote, crude and insensitive, end of quote, for them to expect the immigrant children of past colonized peoples to be satisfied with a mere politics of individual rights. This recognition of immigrants would be best served not only through legalistic changes in hiring practice, but through deeply seated changes in the way children are socialized in Canada. So then he goes on to talk about how the curriculum in Canada needs to be changed so that it reflects the cultural need for recognition on the part of immigrants and other minorities in Canada. And he employs Hans Georg Gadamer's concept of a fusion of horizons to say that this is going to just be a splendid idea, having the Canadian children learn about the culture of many other groups and then fusing it all together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Herder and Gadamer in the last part, and basically that Herder and Gadamer were not immigrant multiculturalists. This fundamental flaw in Taylor's argument is tied to many other inadequacies, misapplications of classical thinkers, projections back into the past of contemporary agendas. Thus, Taylor relies on the ideas of Herder and Gadamer in support of his argument about the need humans have for cultural recognition. Yet an accurate employment of Herder and Gadamer should have entailed, on Taylor's part, recognition of the majority culture of Europeans in Canada in the first instance. This misuse of the ideas of past European thinkers is typical among leftist academics. They like to create the impression that the effort we have been witnessing in the last few decades to transform European nations into diverse societies is somehow supported by the great minds of the past. But immigrant multiculturalism is only a decades-old policy without precedent in the past, possibly the most extreme policy ever implemented in human history. Taylor misinterprets Herder's idea about how all the variety of culture in the world produced by divine providence was meant to bring about a greater harmony, as if Herder was speaking about the promotion of diversity inside nations. The argument of Herder, I can go over that quickly. Basically, as some of you may know, Herder was reacting to the French universal ideals as they were arriving into Germany. And so in many ways, what Herder did was to propose a different universalism based on the actual variety and unique historical experiences and trajectories of each people. Every people, for Herder, had their own particular language, religion, songs, gestures, legends, and customs. There was no common humanity so that you would be able to talk about principles that apply to humanity in general, but a division of peoples into language and ethnic groups. And Herder was a German nationalist who defended the maintenance of German particularity against any notion of rights of man coming from revolutionary France. In fact, in some ways, Herder was a racialist who viewed the races of the world in clearly demarcated ways with their own genetic predispositions and would have dismissed Taylor's effort to fuse all the races and cultures in Canada. Similarly, Taylor misuses the intended purpose of what Gadamer meant by the fusion of horizons. For Gadamer, a horizon was a standpoint that limited the possibility of having an impartial, objective vision. It was an inescapable situation wherein all humans found themselves within a horizon. While Gadamer says that such horizons are not fixed or closed to other perspectives, for otherwise there would have been no changes in the outlooks of the peoples of the world, he does say that all humans inhabit a horizon which conditions their interpretations, which are necessarily prejudicial, but not in the sense that they result in blanket distortions of our understanding of other outlooks, but in the sense that human beings are creatures who can only interpret the world within the horizons they inhabit. They can't be neutral observers outside a context which exists nowhere. Gadamer is known for developing the art or technique of interpretation, hermeneutics, which teaches one how to interpret, explicate, or translate text from a horizon different from one's own. It teaches one to be aware of one's limitedness, how we are always surrounded by a historical context and a tradition. By teaching that we can never overcome our finitude, we learn about how we are situated in a given horizon, and in so learning, we learn about how others are situated in different horizons, and in this way, we may learn how to become more open to their experiences, since we become aware that we are all existing within horizons affected by our own traditions, and that the perspectives of others are as legitimate to them as our perspective is to us. Taylor takes Gadamer's fusion of horizons as a justification for the promotion of mass immigration and multiculturalism in Canada. But Gadamer never said anything about radically transforming the perspective of European nationals by fusing their cultures with the cultures of the world through mass immigration. In fact, his philosophy welcomes the variety of perspectives in the world and does not seek to create a culture that pretends to be universal in its ability to fuse every other horizon within its own horizon. Gadamer was a strong nationalist, a conservative thinker who insisted on the unavoidable reality of human prejudices, not as a negative attribute, but as the very condition of human understanding, since one's horizon is what allows one to have foresight. But what Taylor is saying is that European Canadians should overcome altogether their own attachments to a cultural horizon by recognizing and respecting the cultures of others, the collective rights of others, while suppressing their own heritage and affirming only their individual rights. He views the culture created by European Canadians as a blank slate with no identity of its own. A truly hermeneutic thinking would acknowledge the importance of the Anglo or European traditions and prejudices of the very Canadians who founded the nation, and thus show respect and sympathy for Canadians who are extremely apprehensive and worried about how Canada is undergoing a radical alteration through mass immigration. Gadamer was particularly concerned about our ability to, quote, transpose ourselves into the historical horizon from which the traditional text speaks. Otherwise, we will misunderstand the significance of what it has to say to us. He says that it is, quote, constantly necessary to guard against over hastily assimilating the past to our own expectations of meaning, end of quote. We must, quote, listen to a tradition in a way that permits it to make its own meaning heard, end of quote. But Taylor, a Canadian, can be said to have read Gadamer's text, which was the product of ideas he had been developing since the 1930s, in a rather over-hasty manner by imposing on it meanings and ideas best understood within Canada's mandated multicultural horizon. In fact, Taylor is not even aware of the horizon he's inhabiting, which is that powerful interests in Canada and the Western world are pushing through mass immigration on cultures that never asked for it, and for which there is no precedent in human history, and which goes against the most basic impulses of communities emotionally attached to their heritage. Why should Western society have to deal with the challenge of increasing diversity through mass immigration, which goes way beyond recognizing the collective rights of historical minorities within your nation? Taylor does not pose this question, but takes it for granted that immigration and inclusion of millions of non-Western individuals is part of the natural course of things. He writes, all societies are becoming increasingly multicultural, while at the same time becoming more porous, end of quote. It is worth citing a few more words about this. He writes, this porousness means that they are more open to multinational migration. More of their members live the life of diaspora, whose center is elsewhere. In these circumstances, there is something awkward about replying simply, this is how we do things here, meaning cultural nationals who are apprehensive about other traditions and ways coming into their land. Clearly, what is driving Taylor's search for a way of integrating a politics of recognition with a politics of individual rights is none other than his acceptance of mass immigration as an inevitable phenomenon that cannot be challenged. He pretends, quote, that all societies are becoming increasingly multicultural, end of quote, and experiencing mass immigration, which is what academics tell their students today. The intention is to create a feeling of inevitability and normalcy among ethnic European students regarding their coexistence with ever larger numbers of non-Europeans. Globalization in most of the world, however, is not associated with immigration, only in the West, so that Canada's foreign-born population currently stands at 21%, and Australia's is even higher at 27%. But immobility is typical still today for the vast majority of the world's population. Over 98% of the people in less developed countries in 2005 were born in the country where they reside. immigrants have accounted for a mere 1.4, 1.6% of Asia's population over the past 20 years, despite low fertility rates and so on in Japan, Singapore, and elsewhere. How could someone with Taylor's intellectual stature fall into this trap of misinterpreting Gadamer's text and Herder's text? The simple answer to this question is that the liberal communitarianism Taylor advocates was conceived in an effort to promote racial integration and multiculturalism across the West. Communitarianism in general, which is part of a wider movement critical of the excessive individualism of classical liberalism, sounds very appealing in its emphasis on government initiatives to stem the tide or the erosion of communal life in a fragmented world, in its call for decentralization, a shift of power from centralized bureaucracies into local communities, its concern with families and schools and neighborhoods. Communitarianism sounds very appealing. But ultimately, Taylor's communitarianism and the academic communitarianism of others as well, it's a communitarianism set up against the cultural identity of European peoples and the preservation of their communities. It is a cultural Marxist form of communitarianism in which the ethnic identities of non-Europeans are validated in opposition to any notion of community associated with European ethnicity. Nevertheless, we should accept the basic premises of Taylor's critique of mainstream liberalism in the name of ethnic identity, hold its proponents, the proponents of multiculturalism, to account as to why they think that Europeans and only Europeans should be disallowed from having a sense of communitarianism based on their deep attachment to their ethnic identity and common ancestors. And that's it. All right.